Hello, this is the second part of my video on the life and times of John Locke, this one dealing with the period from 1667 until his death in 1704. In the first part of the video I described the early and largely uneventful part of his life up to 1667, during which he became an Oxford Don. I now want to describe the far more eventful second part of his life, from his association with the Earl of Shaftesbury, through exile in Holland, to his final triumphant return to England. By the 1660s, Locke was well established in Oxford. He had come a long way from his Somerset origins, but his life seemed set to follow the conventional pattern of an Oxford Don, albeit with medical and scientific interests on the side. A chance meeting with Anthony Ashley Cooper in 1666, however, fundamentally changed his life. Cooper, at that time the Lord Ashley, and from 1672 the first Earl of Shaftesbury, had been a major political figure during the interregnum, and had played an important role in the re-establishment of the monarchy. Under Charles II he occupied various high-ranking positions of state, until he became critical of the king's government and became the leader of an opposition network that eventually developed into the Whig Party. Apart from the king himself, he was for many years the most influential political figure in England. I will say more about Shaftesbury in another video. Coming to Oxford for help about a medical condition, Lord Ashley met Locke and was impressed by the younger man's abilities. In the following year, 1667, Locke abandoned his Oxford career and moved to London to become a member of Ashley's household at Exeter House on the Strand. His role as de facto personal physician was confirmed in 1668, when he superintended an operation to drain a life-threatening abscess on Ashley's liver. Henceforth, Ashley regarded Locke as the man who had saved his life. Initially, Locke was able to pursue his medical interests in London, working closely with Sydenham for a while, but later, under Ashley's request and patronage, he became deeply involved in public administration, serving as secretary to the Lords Proprietors of the recently founded colony of Carolina, registrar to the Commissioners of Excise, secretary and treasurer to the Council for Trade and Plantations, and secretary for presentations of ecclesiastical patronage. Under Ashley's influence, he also began to reconsider his own political views, becoming markedly more radical in his opinions, and to think carefully about economic questions of the day. He did not publish anything, but he began to work on various drafts of works that he later published after his return from Holland in 1689. He is also widely assumed to have drafted various political papers for Ashley, by now his friend as well as his employer. This period of intense administrative activity ended in 1675. Shaftesbury was no longer in the government, and was no longer able to dispense patronage, whilst Locke's health was poor. Locke therefore took the opportunity to make an extended tour of France, from 1676 through to 1679. During this time he worked on what would eventually be his essay concerning human understanding, and made a critical study of the work of the French Cartesians. For the moment, philosophical interests predominated in his life. He also met and became friends with many French Protestants, a significant factor in his later view of the French king, Louis XIV's persecution of them. When Locke returned to England in 1679, the political situation was fraught, with stories of a Catholic plot to assassinate the king and replace him with his Catholic brother, James, and a concerted attempt by Shaftesbury and his allies to exclude James from the succession. Under suspicion of treason, Shaftesbury fled England for Amsterdam in 1682, dying shortly thereafter. The first draft of Locke's two treatises of government was probably written at this time. Whig radicals now began to scheme against both King Charles and his brother James, but the government preempted any uprising by arresting and executing known opponents, including several of Shaftesbury's closest supporters. Locke was politically unimportant, and was therefore not amongst the suspects, but was certainly under surveillance as an associate of Shaftesbury. The situation was dangerous, and Locke deemed it prudent to leave England, slipping out of the country in September 1683, thereby beginning his period of exile. Locke spent the next 5 years as an exile in Holland. Although he associated with other Whig exiles and was now on a government watch list of dissidents that it tried unsuccessfully to have extradited, he spent much of his time in intellectual pursuits. Freed from political and administrative distractions, he had time to think and write and prepare final drafts of his major works. He also renewed his medical interests, as well as meeting many of the French Protestant refugees now streaming into Holland after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV in 1685 had placed all their lives in danger. By royal command, the English government also withdrew his Christchurch studentship in 1684. It was a symbolic gesture, finally severing Locke's ties to his former academic career. Everything changed very quickly. After the death of Charles II in 1685, his brother James had become king. Openly Catholic, and seen as wanting to emulate the absolutist style of government practiced by his cousin, Louis XIV of France, James was increasingly mistrusted by powerful members of the English elite. Louis's harsh measures against the French Protestants, most notably from 1685 onwards, also reinforced popular English anti-Catholicism. Finally, a plot was hatched to replace James with his Dutch nephew and son-in-law, William of Orange. William duly arrived at Torbay in November 1688 with a Dutch army. There were minor clashes between his forces and those of James, but most of the English grandees, including the army leaders, sided with William. James was allowed to flee to France, and William and his wife Mary, James's eldest daughter, became joint monarchs at the invitation of Parliament. This was the so-called Glorious Revolution that saw both the clear establishment of constitutional monarchy in Britain and the passing of the Bill of Rights in 1689, an important milestone in the development of civil rights. In these radically changed conditions, Locke returned to England, sailing on the same ship that took the soon-to-be Queen Mary to join her husband. Locke was now 56 years old. He had as yet published nothing of note, but was now able to publish the major works he had been writing or finishing off during his exile. His letter on toleration, published by a friend in Holland in Latin in April, and in English in London in October, his essay concerning human understanding in mid-December, and his 2 treatises of government by the end of the year. This was a remarkable publishing debut. Interestingly, although all 3 works were widely known to be by Locke, he only put his name on the title page of the essay, maintaining a certain distance from the politically sensitive passages of the books on toleration and government until just before his death. From being a political fugitive, Locke was suddenly a popular figure with the new government. Almost immediately on his return to England, he was offered the post of ambassador to the Elector of Brandenburg, an offer he declined for reasons of health. Instead, he acted as an advisor on various matters of state, including the reorganization of the English coinage, the establishment of an effective credit system for the English state through the new Bank of England, and the development of institutions through which the government could promote foreign trade more effectively, himself accepting to serve on the new Board of Trade, for which he was lavishly rewarded. Again, although Locke still refused to publicly acknowledge his authorship of the 2 treatises of government, the book's radical message, that when a sovereign acted as a tyrant, he would break the implicit contract he held with his people and lose their trust and his own legitimacy, and that he could therefore be overthrown, provided an obvious legitimation for the change of monarchs that had just occurred. During the first few years of his return to England, Locke also published a number of other works, including a guidebook on educating children, a treatise on the reasonableness of Christianity, and 2 short notes on economic subjects. He also worked on revised editions of several of his books and responded vigorously in print to criticisms of them. He was now a famous man, one of his supporters going so far as to describe him as the greatest man in the world. Many of his views remained controversial, however. particularly amongst Anglican conservatives, who suspected him, perhaps rightly, of fashioning his own liberal version of Christianity. Finally, exhausted by London, he retired to the estate of Lady Damaris Masham at Oates in Essex. Masham was one of the few women philosophers of the period and a long-time friend of Locke. Locke died there on the 28th of October, 1704. He was 72 years old. He was buried in the nearby churchyard in High Laver, where a memorial tablet was erected based on his own epitaph for himself. It reads, "Stay, traveller, near this place lies John Locke. If you ask what sort of man he was, the answer is that he was contented with his modest lot. Bred a scholar, he used his studies to devote himself to truth alone. This you may learn from his writings, which will show you anything else that is to be said about him more faithfully than the doubtful eulogies of an epitaph. His virtues, if he had any, were too slight for him to offer them to his own credit, or as an example to you. Let his vices be buried with him. Of good life you have an example, should you desire it in the gospel. Of vice, would there were none for you. Of mortality, surely, and you may profit by it, you have one here and everywhere. That he was born on the 29th of August in the year of our Lord, 1632, and that he died on the 28th of October in the year of our Lord, 1704. This tablet, which itself will quickly perish, is a record. Thank you for listening.